That's great. Yeah, I really appreciate your drawing attention to this. I think this is super important. It's remarkable to me how much little consensus there is on using this term. And I think it's diagnostic of our problem of psychology and confusion.
Hmm.
So let me tell you what I think of depression as being. Depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay, I'll say that again.
Hmm.
What is depression? It's a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay.
Hmm.
Well, what is a shutdown, and what do we mean by that? Well, at the kind of the animal layer of your being, okay, the animal, you're an organism, you're a living organism, and then at the base of that, you're also an animal. The animal part of the organism is your neuromuscular sensory motor loop. Okay, basically, it's your brain, your
Hmm.
structural muscular body. And what is
Hmm.
it that makes you quite different than a tree, or what makes animals quite different? They get up and they move around. Okay.
Right,
Trees do
right.
lots of cool stuff, but they don't get up as whole entities and move around. Well, animals have this sensory motor looping system that allows them to get up and move around. And the core of that is that, well, how's it going to invest its action? Because it's expensive and risky. It's going to spend its behavioral investment in particular ways. And it has a behavioral activation system that then gets kind of organized into positive emotion. Behavioral activation, positive emotion is like, oh, you desire that. You want that. When you get it, it's good and it's reinforcing. So, in other words, it engages you in the world. It's sort of like the gas of your energy system. It's like, hey, you want that, you desire that, you get excited, you get enthusiastic, you feel pleasure, you learn from engagement in the environment through
Is
that.
that related to serotonin and dopamine?
Yep, and dopamine in particular, serotonin, the dopaminergic track in particular tracks reward in this particular way. Okay.
Got it.
Serotonin is super complicated, but it actually relates more, if we're going to emphasize anything, it relates more to the second side of this, where one is the gas, the behavioral activation, positive emotion, go out there and get that thing, to the
Hmm.
brakes, which is, oh no, the world is filled with threat. Oh no, bad stuff can happen. Movement is expensive and risky. So you have a behavioral avoidance system that then manifests a negative emotional feeling focused on danger, risk, threat. You have an anxious, active side, and then a passive, depressed, shutdown side. Okay, that says, hey, the world's bad out there. You're going to get hurt. You're going to get starved. You're going to better just to hunker down and do nothing and hope things get better. Okay, so
Hmm.
if you have a gas that goes out and explores and gives you positive notion, and then you have a brake system, well, when I talk about depression, what I'm talking about is a systematic shift in the gas brake relation. So the
Hmm.
shutdown basically means that instead of where normally you have a certain amount of gas that your animal system is like pushing towards, this shrinks the gas, basically pulls off the gas and makes the brake system much more active. So another
Hmm.
way of saying that is it makes you anhedonic. That's the technical clinical term for anhedonia. Hedonia is pleasure, and
Hmm.
meaning here absence of pleasure. So people, when you're depressed, stuff doesn't taste as good. It doesn't seem nearly as exciting. You don't really feel like doing anything. Okay.
Yeah.
And then so your depression is about pulling that gas down and then jacking up. You feel more pain, you feel more discomfort, you ruminate on things going badly, you anticipate more things will go bad, you look back on failures and you're more likely to remember failures. So depression is a state of behavioral shutdown whereby the gas or the behavioral activation is pulled down, so you feel less positive emotion and pleasure, and the negative affect system and the brakes on the system are really jacked up. And really, you basically, forgive my French, but you feel like shit and you don't feel like doing shit. That is
Right.
the state. Okay.
Sure.
Now the question is, well, is that a state? Is that a disease state? I mean, is that a state that emerges because of biophysiological malfunction? And the answer is, well, sometimes, yeah. Actually,
Sure.
you can get injuries to the behavioral activation system. In theory, the serotonin system sort of actually serves as an inhibitor of the inhibiting system, and the whole selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors basically inhibit and they regulate the system. So you can wonder whether or not you have sort of the right chemical mix. Now you'll hear people talk about a chemical imbalance with depression. That's the idea that maybe chemicals, the neurochemical chemistry is off key. That's actually a very weak and not a very great model, but you can wonder about, oh, there may be ways in which systems can go wrong. A problem that does happen with some degree of regularity is you get problems with your thyroid gland. And if it doesn't produce the right kind of hormones, you can get hypothyroidism, and that makes you feel kind of blah and down and depressed. So you can get malfunctions in the biophysiology that give rise to a shift and cause the system to shut down. Lots of different things can do that. But just think about it, your everyday world. I mean, I ask all of your listeners to just think about when you get up and you hope for something and then something bad happens. And then you're, 2 hours later, another unexpected bad happened thing. And then you come home and then you lose your keys and you're trying to and all of a sudden you're like, God, this just sucks, right? I mean, this is just, what a lousy day. And there's a lot of research. If you get hit by 3 unexpected bad things like in a day, you will go through a mini depressive phase shift for most people. In fact, all of a sudden you'll be like, and then you'll go into a state-based depressed mood, which then usually lasts for an hour or two, where you just sort of feel like crap. And you're like, nothing's going right for me. This sucks. Well, that's a mini little depressive phase shift. A clinical depression is really just extending that across a dimension of severity over time. There's usually a criteria of, it's got to be at least 2 weeks, and you have to be in this state more times than not over a 2-week period. So it's really just on a dimension. I do think there are some things to certain kinds of clinical biochemical phase shifts that give rise to depression. But basically, then we just put this depressed mood on a continuum. And when it reaches a clinically significant cutoff, we call that a major depressive episode. It is the case by the time that's happening, we're seeing a lot of shifts in the biophysiology and brain patterning. I am very hesitant to label that a disease. Since we were talking about shootings and whatnot, one of the greatest, most horrific mass shootings was the Sandy Hook shooting that took place. I don't even remember what it was, 7 years ago or whatever. Well, they did a follow-up. I think it was 2 years after, maybe 1 year after. And I think they identified as half of the parents of the victims. That was like a kindergarten, elementary school shooting. And half of the parents of the victims were meeting criteria for depression a year after that event. And you're like, well, what happened? Did their brains just go wrong? And you're like, of course not. I mean, their life purpose and investment pattern was to take care of their children, to see their children carry on, to have anticipated decades of development, of love, of care, of manifesting reward. And I mean that in the richest human sense. And then all of a sudden have that path of investment and connection and be obliterated and never to be replaced again. Well, that is an absolute, classic, horrific recipe, tragic recipe for the system, the animal system, just to shut down around that. So it's a pretty natural and understandable thing when you put it in that way. There are biological reasons for it. There are tragic environmental situations that can trigger it. There are also more, cognitive, emotional, relational, maybe psychological issues that give rise to how people can get trapped in these vicious cycles of behavioral shutdown.
So let me see if I can make a little synopsis and make a kind of comment at the same time and see how you respond to this. It sounds like, so your animal system, we're biological creatures, although we're minded. And part of this involves the fact that we have brains, which take a fair amount of metabolic expenditure to be able to use. Yeah. And this goes into a, pursuit of goals and, better states of being. And that usually runs pretty hunky-dory unless there's a hitch. When there's a hitch, there's such a need for sort of downshifting from that goal seeking so that you can, maybe experience the rest that you need, or maybe not make the situation more tense by adding additional complexity or whatever it may be. But for some reason, that biological system downshifts accordingly. And this can take all sorts of different forms, and it can be experienced in different degrees. When it's experienced in a very significant degree, that's when you're going to need yourself some psychological care. You might even need medical attention. But whether or not you want to call that a disease is a challenge. It sounds like there are a lot of good reasons to not do that, but there might be an inclination to want to do it because, I mean, obviously we all want to try to take care of people who are suffering. Am I in the right ballpark?
100%.